I haven't posted any videos in quite some time, but it's not like I haven't been doing anything. As you can see, I have plenty of projects going on. I got a Traxxas there, I got this Yokomo I got to rebuild, an RC10T that I'm working on, tuning, some Kyosho stuff here, another Pro XRT I'm building, I got another Kyosho Triumph that I want to make into a project car, plus, projects up there to work on, so there's plenty to do. But a lot of these things are not particularly new as far as builds go. So I didn't think it would be worth posting videos on those, at least for now. But recently I picked up this little bad boy, which is a Kyosho Lazer ZX-S Evolution, and I figured I'd make several videos about this. This is the first among them. Basically, the ZX-S Evolution, for those who don't know, is the final iteration of the belt drive Kyosho lasers. It's based loosely on the Lazer ZX-R, which is this guy right here. This is actually the ZX-RR, so this is sort of the final version of the ZX-R series, if you will. And I did a few videos on this. You can go back and take a look. And there are some components that are shared between these two, like the suspension arms are shared. I think the hub carriers are similar. The steering block, the knuckle is similar. The steering rack is compatible. The front and rear diffs are the same. The wing mounts are the same. But other than that, a lot of parts are different. The rear hub carriers are different. The shocks are different, the shock towers are different, the front suspension geometry is different, the chassis is different, the front and rear gearbox assemblies are completely different. So this is a real step up, if you will, in terms of the changes that Kyosho tried to make to the car to make it more competitive. That's not to say, by the way, that the ZX-RR isn't any good. I love this car. This is a fantastic car. And I will probably bring it to the Vintage Off-Road Nationals again this year, if I can go this year. But the reason why, by the way, I have this out and this Yokomo YZ10 is because the ZX-S Evolution does borrow a little bit from the YZ10, in particular the front suspension setup. So if you look here, you see this upper front suspension arm here that actually looks quite a lot like what Yokomo had used on their 94 and 95 YZ10s. The Lazer ZX-R series didn't have that. It just has a normal turnbuckle as you would have on most four-wheel drive buggies. I don't know exactly why Kyosho decided to do this, why you wouldn't just have a normal turnbuckle. I'd have to think more about that, but no matter. It's actually a slightly better version of what Yokomo had done on their YZ10. So the way that this mounts on the YZ10 is you have one hinge pin on the inside here that mounts the inside of that upper arm, and then you go through a turnbuckle to a ball end that mounts onto the caster block. You have kind of the same thing here, with the exception that on the YZ10 there was only one mounting point for the inside hinge pin here, and because the way that the ball end mounts onto the caster block, there's really no adjustment here either. So camber gain and roll center on these late model YZ10s are basically fixed. There's little to nothing you can do about it. There might be a few tricks you can play about it, but I won't get into that right now. On the Lazer ZX-S Evolution, basically this arm here mounts between the front shock tower and this little plate here that goes behind some portion of the front gearbox, and there are three holes, 1, 2, 3. So you can pick which one you want to mount it on, which means you can adjust camber gain by mounting this to the inside or outside. And this ball stud here is also the kingpin for the steering knuckle. So you can put spacers under this if you wanted, I would presume, to increase the height, to change the roll center. So if you're on a high grip track, you might bump this up a little bit to increase the roll center and get a little bit less roll on the chassis, for example. So that's one area where Kyosho was kind of late to the game as far as like front suspension design, but they actually made some improvements there. The front, while we're on the front end, the front shock tower is completely different from what you have on the ZX-RR. The ZX-RR has this kind of like loop around shape. I don't know exactly what I would even call this shape, but it has 6 mounting holes for the shocks, 3 holes on the top, another 3 holes on the bottom, plus I think 3 mounting points for the inner camber link. So plenty of adjustability, but slightly different geometry. On the ZX-RR, you just have 3 holes here on the top of the tower, and that's it. So there's really not much in the way of adjusting droop unless you get this tower reproduced with some, additional holes here on the bottom, so you could mount the shock down a bit and then push the front arms down. I may do that. I do plan, by the way, on sending various components of this car out for reproduction to make it easier for me to run it, as well as for others to run it and to build their own. So that's a little service I'll be providing to the laser community. Moving to the rear, by the way, the rear gearbox, again, totally different. This is a very open gearbox. You can see the pulleys, front and rear pulleys here. On the Lazer ZX-R series, the front and rear gearboxes were basically closed. The only openings in the gearbox were just for the belt to come in and out. On the ZX-S Evo, this is all very open, and also the assembly is different. So this has 2 plates, one on the left, and actually 3 plates, 1, 2, 3, and then there are 2 lower gearbox halves left and right, such that the rear differential mounts between the 2 plates for the upper part of the gearbox, and then onto the lower left and right halves of the gearbox on the bottom. I printed out an instruction manual to kind of show what that would look like. Let me just flip to that for a minute. Second here. Right here. So you have this lower left and right half that houses the bottom portion of the diff bearings, and then you have these plates here that the diff pulley goes into for the top piece, and these all mate together somehow. Okay, and then for the front gearbox, by the way, while we're on the subject of gearboxes, kind of the same concept where you have upper halves left and right, and then you also have left and right lower halves. Okay, so these parts are not shared with the ZX-R platform, which means that they are much harder to find, because the ZX-S Evolution, by the way, is a very rare car. They only made, I think, 200 of these, and finding them is very difficult. And then winning an auction on them is even more difficult and considerably more expensive. So just having the car is hard enough. Finding spare parts for something like a gearbox is almost impossible. So I plan to send out a lot of these unique parts that are specific to the ZX-S Evolution to a source that I found that will CAD those up and make them available for 3D printing on Shapeways. So anyway, moving on, just flipping through the manual here. It does come with a rear anti-roll bar as standard. You could get a rear anti-roll bar on the Lazer, but it was an aftermarket part, so it's kind of a minor point. The shocks are different. The original, the ZX-RR shocks were the Kyosho equalizer shocks. And then before that, on the ZX-R Mark I, you had the old style gold Kyosho shocks. Those are all very good shocks, but it wasn't until you got to the ZX-S Evolution where you started to see what's essentially like the triple cap Kyosho shocks that we have today, where you have this cap unit and then a plastic unit here that mounts inside the cap. And then you could set this up as either aeration or bladder shock, where you put a bladder on top, and that keeps all the air bubbles out. And I believe you bleed them from the bottom here, this bottom seal assembly. So this is a lot more like a modern Kyosho shock, if you will. It's just a standard bore rather than a big bore. Let's see, what else kind of stands out about this chassis? For the ZX-S platform, if you will, there were actually two variants of this. There was the the first iteration of the ZX-S, which did not come with Kyosho shocks. It came with low-C shocks, and it had some other differences to compared to this car, such as the lower deck. The lower deck on the original ZX-S was a one-piece lower deck that had a kick-up incorporated into the cut, the carbon fiber cut for that deck. And on the ZX-S Evolution, they changed that so that you had basically a three-piece lower deck. Let me just get to the picture here to make it easier to describe. So this was the lower portion of the chassis, and then you have an aluminum kick-up plate here that connects to it, and they're mated together with this additional plate that goes through 6 screws to mate these all together. And then the front gearbox mounts on this kick-up plate here. So you can get reproduction kick-up plates, which is great. And you can get, you know, reproduction chassis parts here from Fiberlight, which is also great. But yes, the ZX-S Evolution made this change. The original ZX-S did not have that. I don't know all of the differences between them, but that is the key signature difference between the two. So if you do happen to find a ZX-S on eBay or any other, you know, auction website, trying to figure out whether it's an Evo or not, that's the telltale sign right there. What else kind of stands out? I don't know, it's various bits and bobs. You have these clear Lexan covers to the front and rear gearboxes. Again, because you have, you know, these like 4 sort of diff corner pieces or gearbox corner pieces to the gearboxes, and then this clear cover is there to, you know, seal it off. I don't know why they did it this way. Maybe they were trying to, you know, reduce the center of gravity in some way compared to the old setup here with the old style gearboxes. I don't know exactly. But the diffs, as far as I can tell, are the same diffs that you would use in the ZXR series. So that is, as far as I know, they're unchanged. For this particular unit, the previous owner seems to have replaced the front diff with a front one-way, which I don't fully understand because he has a one-way in the front pulley, but there's also a one-way here on the center pulley. So, like, why would you need to double up on that? That seems kind of stupid to me. So I have to do 2 things here. I have to replace this with an actual ball diff, and then I also have to figure out how to lock this center one-way. I know on like the ZXR series, you have this little nut here with a friction plate, and that allows you to adjust how much one-way action you have for the front. I assume it's the same thing here for this unit, but I have to take this apart and check to see whether the previous owner, you know, mucked this up somehow and made it impossible to make that adjustment. And if so, I got to figure out what parts I need to change that back. Other things, I guess, just some commentary on this car. Again, this is a very rare car, extremely difficult to find. This particular one was maybe not my most expensive car in my collection that I have. As far as like total amount of money spent on the car. At the end, though, by the time I'm done with everything, it might end up being that much. But yeah, these are very hard to find. And then people that have them, you know, tend to keep them new in box, which I completely get. You know, I have new in box vintage kits myself. I have no opposition to that. But then the ones that do run them, you know, they tend to be very conservative about like selling some of their parts to someone else because the parts are so hard to find and they're so uncommon and they're so rare. I get it. That's why I want to take this particular one and, you know, get the unique parts to someone who can set it up for 3D printing. And there are other changes I'm thinking of making to this car because I don't plan on making this a shelf queen. The previous owner really like did a number on this car. It looks like they ran it, and they ran it well, I suppose. So this will be a runner, and I do intend on provisionally I do intend on running this at the Vintage Off-Road Nationals at some point. Not this year, it won't be ready by then, plus I have plenty of other cars to run as it is. But at some point in the future I do plan on actually running this. And let's see. I don't know. There's not much else to say about it other than it was it was a lot of money, and I think this will be an interesting project. I do intend on doing a bit more development on this car. As I understand it, from what I've researched on the ZX-S Evolution, is that it wasn't really a complete design. Apparently it was a little bit rushed, and so there were certain components of the car that weren't fully developed. If I had to guess, maybe some things related to the suspension geometry, the adjustability of the car. So, maybe there are some things I can do about that. And then there's some smaller things that I'll do, like, replacing these universal joints with, like modern Kyosho CVAs. Maybe playing some games with the wheel hex width, like what I did on the ZX-R and my Inferno 10, to, make the car a little wider, a bit more stable. So there's a bunch of stuff that I might play around with on this car. So this is like a more of a long-term project. But I'm glad to say that I have one of these. If you're like a really hardcore vintage collector, there are a small number of chassis that are really, like, you could call them unicorn chassis. You have like the MIP 410 Legend, 10th Technology Predator, not the X10, which is a nice car, but an original Predator, very hard to find. Maybe like an RPM Ultra Mold. Those are pretty nice. Also pretty rare, at least to find one in original condition, undyed white plastic. And maybe a few others, like a Yokomo 93 World Championship Special, for instance. So this is among those. The ZX-S Evo is extremely difficult to find car. So I'm glad I finally have one in my collection, and I do plan on using this and doing things to it that other people with a ZX-S are too chicken shit to do. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks for watching.